The artificial gravity aboard the orbital diplomatic station made Zarovex feel sluggish. At 9 feet tall with 4 powerful arms and an obsidian exoskeleton that could deflect small arms fire, the war champion of the Silnari Dominion was accustomed to intimidating lesser species into immediate compliance. Today it would be no different, she thought, as she surveyed the human delegation with compound eyes that registered both visible light and thermal signatures. "Your Earth has resources we require," she announced, her translator converting the clicks and vibrations of her native speech into the dominant human language. Her mandibles flexed with barely contained disdain as she continued. "Our studies indicate your species lacks the physical capabilities to resist us. However, our traditions demand I offer you the ancient right of challenge before we begin planetary integration." The assembled human diplomats exchanged worried glances around the polished obsidian table. Their research had confirmed what everyone in the room could plainly see. The Silnari warrior caste possessed strength 3 times that of the strongest human, with reaction speeds that made them appear to move like liquid shadow in combat situations. The Dominion's unbroken 4-century record of conquests spanned 12 star systems, each now providing resources and labor to the expanding empire. Ambassador Collins cleared his throat, buying time. "Perhaps we could discuss alternative arrangements. Earth has much to offer through trade and cultural exchange." Zarovex's upper arms performed a dismissive gesture that resembled a shrug. "The Dominion does not trade with species categorized as resource providers. Your classification was determined upon first contact analysis." Her lower right arm activated a holographic display showing human physical capabilities compared to Silnari standards. The disparity was immediately apparent and deliberately humiliating. From the back of the room, a woman in a simple grey uniform stood. Captain Ilara Reed was not physically imposing, average height with a lean build that suggested efficiency rather than power. Her short, practical hair framed a face notable only for eyes that revealed nothing of her thoughts. The subtle insignia on her collar identified her as part of Earth's Special Combat Division, though this meant nothing to the alien delegation. "I accept your challenge," she said simply, her voice carrying clearly despite its measured tone. Ambassador Collins turned in alarm. "Captain Reed, that's not." "It is my right under Section 17 of the First Contact Protocols." Reed interrupted smoothly, her eyes never leaving the towering alien. Zarovex tilted her head, compound eyes reflecting multiple images of the unremarkable human. Her sensory appendages vibrated slightly, analyzing the mammalian creature that had volunteered for ceremonial combat. "You misunderstand, small one," she said, using the diminutive deliberately. "This is combat to submission or death. I have ended 37 champions from worlds far more warlike than yours. Worlds with warriors twice your size and natural armaments." She extended one arm, demonstrating the razor-edged chitin blades that could emerge from her forearm sheaths. Captain Reed approached the alien, looking up at the 9-foot warrior with perfect composure. The difference in their stature was almost comical, a fact not lost on the Silnari attendants, who made chittering sounds that their translation devices tactfully did not convert. "I understand completely," Reed replied, showing no reaction to the implied threat or mockery. "The right of challenge allows the challenged species to select their champion, and I am Earth's choice. We accept your terms of combat to submission." She paused, then added with practiced diplomacy, "Shall we begin tomorrow? I assume your traditions include formal preparation time." For the first time in her decorated career, Zarovex felt something unexpected, confusion at the human's calm confidence. There was no fear sent, no elevated heart rate, no stress hormones that her sensory appendages could detect. She dismissed this anomaly immediately, attributing it to the strangeness of mammalian biology. Very well, the alien champion agreed, all 4 arms performing the ceremonial gesture of acceptance. 1 planetary rotation for preparation. The combat arena aboard our flagship will be prepared. She leaned forward slightly, bringing her face closer to the humans. I recommend you use this time to settle your affairs. This will be my easiest victory yet. Captain Reed simply nodded, the ghost of a smile touching her lips. We'll see. The Silnary combat vessel hummed with activity as technicians transformed its central chamber into a proper arena. Workers extended retractable platforms around the circular combat space, creating tiered observation decks where dignitaries from various vassal species gathered. The atmosphere buzzed with anticipation, not for the combat itself, which everyone considered a foregone conclusion, but for the formal incorporation of Earth into the Dominion that would follow. In her preparation chamber, Zaravex underwent the ritual combat enhancement. She stood perfectly still as attendants in ceremonial robes moved around her, applying sacred unguents to her joint segments and reciting the ancient battle litanies of her caste. Champion, the preliminary injection sequence is ready, announced her personal physician, approaching with a specialized delivery device. The clear cylinder contained a luminescent blue compound that swirled and pulsed as if alive. Zaravex extended her primary left arm. Proceed. The device connected to specialized ports in her exoskeleton, and the compound flowed into her system. Almost immediately, her already formidable carapace hardened further, developing a subtle iridescent sheen. Her neural responses sharpened as specialized chemicals flooded her combat reflexes. Your biometrics are optimal, the physician noted, studying the diagnostic display. Combat enhancement is operating at 97% efficiency, well above required levels for a Class 3 opponent. Her tactical advisor, a smaller male of her species, approached with a data tablet. I've completed the behavioral analysis of human combat records. They rely primarily on projectile weapons and electronic warfare. Their limited physical confrontation techniques appear entirely inadequate against Silnary capabilities. Zaravex flexed her forearms as attendants attached ceremonial blades to her secondary limbs, lightweight, razor-edged extensions of her natural weaponry. Analysis of human physiology indicates they lack redundant organ systems, possess no natural armor, and have reaction times 78% slower than our warriors, the advisor continued, scrolling through detailed anatomical schematics. Recommendation is swift incapacitation to minimize risk of accidental death. The Dominion prefers functional labor resources. Zaravex performed the ritual combat salute to the ancestral shrine in her chamber. I will honor tradition with a worthy demonstration. The human's courage, however misplaced, deserves respect. Meanwhile, in the modest chamber assigned to the human, Captain Reed sat cross-legged on the floor, eyes closed in deep meditation. She had declined the elaborate meal offered by her hosts, consuming only a small protein concentrate and water. The only equipment she had requested was a simple cloth headband, which she now tied across her forehead with practiced movements. Admiral Chen entered after a respectful knock, closing the door behind him. His expression betrayed the concern he had carefully hidden during the diplomatic exchange. The neural recordings of previous Silnary combats have been analyzed, he said quietly, keeping his voice low despite the room's security screening. Their fighting style relies on overwhelming force and speed, using their multiple limbs to create attack patterns too complex for most opponents to track. They've never faced someone using your approach. Ilara opened her eyes. They evolved as apex predators on a high-gravity world with few natural threats. Their combat techniques reflect that history. They've never needed to innovate beyond their natural advantages. And humans? The Admiral asked, though he already knew the answer. We survived as prey before becoming predators, Ilara replied, standing with fluid grace that revealed thousands of hours of disciplined training. Everything we have, we earn through adaptation. That makes all the difference. She began a series of stretching exercises, movements so precisely controlled that they appeared almost mechanical in their perfection. The diplomatic corps is preparing contingencies in case this goes poorly, Chen admitted. Evacuation protocols for key personnel and... It won't be necessary, Ilara interrupted, her voice carrying absolute conviction. I've studied every available record of Silnari combat techniques. Their patterns are predictable to someone trained to see them. She paused, completing a complex movement sequence before adding, their overconfidence is their vulnerability. They've never had to question their physical superiority, so they've never developed beyond it. Admiral Chen nodded slowly, wanting to believe her. Earth is counting on you, Captain. I know, she replied simply. Tell the diplomats to prepare for negotiations, not evacuation. By this time tomorrow, the Silnari will be reassessing their entire understanding of humanity. The central arena aboard the Silnari flagship gleamed under carefully calibrated lighting designed to favor their compound vision. A low hum of anticipation filled the chamber as representatives from 24 species filled the observation platforms. Many wore the distinctive insignia that marked them as former adversaries now integrated into the Dominion hierarchy. They watched with a mixture of curiosity and remembered resignation. A resonant tone signaled the arrival of the Silnari champion. Zaravex entered through the ceremonial archway, her enhanced exoskeleton catching the light in iridescent ripples. The assembled aliens erupted in thunderous approval, some standing to perform traditional gestures of respect. Her ceremonial combat harness displayed embedded tokens representing previous victories, the weight of her accomplishments visible in every confident stride. Glory to the champion who expands the Dominion, intoned the master of ceremonies, a venerable Silnari whose scarred carapace testified to his own combat history. Honor to she who maintains the ancient traditions. Zaravex acknowledged the accolades with formal gestures, taking her position in the center of the arena. Her forearms extended in the ritual combat stance, primary limbs forward for grappling, secondary arms positioned for striking and defense. A second, distinctly different tone announced the human challenger. When Ilara entered wearing only a simple fitted combat suit with minimal protection, murmurs of disbelief rippled through the audience. Some spectators activated magnification devices to better see the apparently suicidal human. Standing opposite the towering alien, Captain Reed appeared almost childlike in comparison. The human representative enters the sacred space, the master of ceremonies announced, his tone carrying a hint of regret for what was about to occur. May her courage be remembered. An uncomfortable silence fell as the spectators processed the obvious mismatch. Even those who had wagered resources on a swift victory seemed suddenly hesitant to witness it. Before we begin, Zaravex announced, her translator projecting her voice throughout the arena, I extend the traditional offer of honorable surrender. There is no shame in acknowledging biological reality. The subtext was clear to everyone present. This was an opportunity for humanity to maintain some dignity in defeat. Several alien diplomats nodded approvingly at this gesture of mercy. Ilara rolled her shoulders, settled into a relaxed stance that experts in combat would recognize as deceptively neutral, and replied simply, "Thank you, but no." The Master of Ceremonies signaled for the containment field to activate. A subtle shimmer surrounded the combat area, designed to protect spectators while preventing either combatant from leaving until resolution was achieved. "Combat commences at the signal," he announced, raising a ceremonial staff. "Victory is achieved through submission or incapacitation." He brought the staff down with a sharp crack. At the signal, Zaravex launched forward with explosive speed, her primary arms extended for a grapple that would end the contest in seconds. The movement was a blur even to the enhanced vision of the alien observers. A textbook execution of the Dominion's most efficient combat technique. To the astonishment of everyone watching, the human was no longer there. With a fluid motion that seemed impossibly fast, Ilara had shifted just enough for the alien to grasp empty air. The movement was so precise, so economical, that it appeared the human had somehow anticipated exactly where the attack would land. Zaravex pivoted instantly, secondary arms slashing in a precise pattern designed to corral and trap an opponent. Again, the human moved with an economy of motion that wasted nothing, each step placing her exactly where the alien's strikes were not. After 3 minutes of increasingly complex attacks meeting nothing but air, Zaravex paused, her breathing apparatus working harder than expected. Something impossible was happening. The weak human was not just surviving, but making the champion look clumsy and ineffective. "Interesting strategy," Zaravex hissed, resetting her stance. "But avoidance is not victory." Ilara smiled slightly. "I'm not avoiding. I'm learning." 40 minutes into what was supposed to be a brief demonstration, the atmosphere in the arena had transformed completely. Alien spectators leaned forward. Investment bankers frantically revised odds on their data terminals, and military observers recorded every movement with intense focus. Zaravex had abandoned her ceremonial combat patterns in favor of raw efficiency. Her forearms moved in coordinated strikes, designed to overwhelm any defense through sheer complexity. Yet the human continued to evade with movements that seemed to anticipate each attack before it fully developed. When Ilara finally initiated her first counterattack, it came without warning. As the alien's secondary right arm extended in a diagonal slash, the human stepped inside the attack radius, a move considered suicidal against a Silnari warrior. Before Zaravex could capitalize on this apparent mistake, Ilara delivered a precise strike to a point where the champion's arm segment connected to her thorax. A sharp crack echoed through the arena as the human's knuckles found the nearly invisible seam in the alien's exoskeleton. Zaravex felt her right secondary arm go momentarily numb, not damaged, but temporarily useless as the nerve cluster beneath the armor registered the precise pressure. The audience fell silent. The human had not only defended successfully, but had somehow identified a vulnerability that should have been unknown to our species. "First contact," Ilara said quietly, already moving back to a safe distance. Zaravex recalibrated her approach, engaging her combat enhancement to higher levels. Her vision sharpened further, time seeming to slow as her neural processors accelerated. She launched a combination attack that her trainers had assured her no biological entity could fully track, primary arms moving in mirrored arcs, while her secondary limbs targeted the human's lower extremities. Ilara's response defied explanation. She moved not with panic or desperate speed, but with a fluid precision that suggested she was following a choreographed routine. Each of the alien's strikes missed by millimeters, the human's movements so economical that she appeared to be conserving energy while Zaravex expended hers. When the human countered again, she targeted 3 different nerve clusters in rapid succession. Each strike landed with surgical precision, causing momentary disruptions to the aliens' combat systems. "How are you doing this?" Zaravex demanded after a particularly effective strike temporarily compromised her lower left arm's mobility. "Our anatomy is classified information." Ilara circled carefully, hands raised in a guard position that constantly adjusted to the alien's movements. "Your species moves according to your physical structure. To trained human eyes, that reveals everything we need to know. My ancestors developed combat systems specifically designed to defeat larger, stronger opponents. We've had thousands of years to perfect these techniques." For the first time, unease rippled through Zaravex's confidence. Her species conquered through overwhelming biological superiority. They had never encountered a species that specialized in overcoming such advantages. In the observation deck reserved for high-ranking Silnari officials, the mood had shifted dramatically. The High Commander, a scarred veteran of countless Conquest campaigns, turned to his strategic advisor. "Explain what I am seeing." The advisor's mandibles clicked nervously as he analyzed the combat data streaming across his display. The human is applying principles of neurological disruption that should be beyond their understanding of our physiology. Each strike is targeting control junctions with increasing precision. She appears to be learning our biological weaknesses in real time. "Impossible," the commander responded, though his tone lacked conviction. "No species can adapt that quickly." "This one appears to be doing exactly that," the advisor replied. He hesitated before adding, "And if this individual can do so, what might their military units accomplish with proper preparation?" Below in the arena, Zaravex adjusted her tactics again, increasing the randomness of her attack patterns to counter the human's apparent predictive ability. Ilara matched this adaptation seamlessly, her movements becoming equally unpredictable. "Your species has impressive natural weapons," Ilara observed during a momentary lull in the exchange. "Humans took a different evolutionary path. We became tool users because we lacked physical advantages. That forced us to become problem solvers instead." Zaravex realized with growing concern that this was not merely combat, it was education. The human was deliberately prolonging the exchange to demonstrate capabilities that would be reported to Earth's military command. The true battle, she suddenly understood, was not for her victory, but for the Dominion's strategic assessment of humanity's threat level. 2 hours into the combat, sweat gleamed on Ilara's skin, while Zaravex's exoskeleton showed signs of stress. Microfractures, appearing where repeated movements had taxed even its enhanced durability. The arena's environmental systems had adjusted several times to compensate for the heat generated by the prolonged exchange. In the diplomatic observation box, Admiral Chen watched with carefully controlled expression as Earth's ambassador fielded urgent communications from the home planet. The unexpected duration of the combat had drawn the attention of every major military power on Earth, all demanding updates and strategic assessments. "Tell them patience," Chen murmured to the ambassador. "This is proceeding exactly as Captain Reed predicted." Back in the arena, Zaravex deployed her final tactical advantage, extending hidden venom sacs in her primary arms. The neurotoxin was technically permitted under combat rules, though rarely needed against outmatched opponents. Small ports opened along her forearm sheaths, releasing a barely visible mist designed to disorient and weaken. "Your resistance has been impressive," she acknowledged, circling more cautiously now. "But this ends now." Ilara noticed the subtle change in her opponent's stance and the almost imperceptible atmospheric shift. She adjusted her breathing pattern immediately, filtering air through the specially treated fabric of her collar, a precaution the human team had anticipated might be necessary. "Introducing a toxin component?" she asked, continuing to move in unpredictable patterns. "Interesting. Is that standard procedure when you're losing?" The question struck like a physical blow. In all her combat history, no one had ever suggested Zara Vex might lose. The momentary psychological disruption was all Elara needed. The human moved with sudden, explosive speed that contradicted everything the Silnari knew about human capabilities. What followed was a precisely executed sequence of strikes that targeted the alien's balance centers, sensory inputs, and neural junctions. Zara Vex found herself on the arena floor, two arms temporarily paralyzed, equilibrium severely compromised. The complex neurotoxin dispersal system in her primary left arm had been rendered inoperable by a strike so precisely targeted that it seemed impossible without internal schematics of her biology. The alien viewers went completely silent. This outcome violated everything they understood about physical combat and species hierarchy. Several of the Dominion's vassal species representatives exchanged meaningful glances, the first silent communication of potential resistance in generations. As Zara Vex struggled to rise, Elara stepped back respectfully, allowing her opponent to regain her footing without further attack. The gesture was not lost on the audience. The human was demonstrating not just combat superiority, but ethical restraint. "Your species relies on natural advantages," Elara explained, her voice carrying in the silent arena. "Humans rely on knowledge, adaptation, and technique. We turned our physical limitations into a different kind of strength." Zara Vex regained her stance, her biomonitors indicating significant system strain. Combat enhancement chemicals surged through her system in compensatory response. "You move with unusual speed for your species' capabilities," she noted, reassessing her opponent with newfound respect. "That's another human specialty," Elara explained, maintaining perfect readiness despite the extended combat duration. "We train to exceed our limitations. What you're seeing isn't my natural speed. It's the result of 20 years of disciplined practice, pushing beyond what should be possible." In the High Command observation deck, emergency strategic sessions had convened. The combat data defied their predictive models. The advisor's mandibles clicked rapidly as he summarized the implications. If their elite warriors can adapt during combat to exploit weaknesses they shouldn't even be able to detect, their military doctrine must be fundamentally different from anything we've encountered. This suggests their apparent technological limitations may be similarly deceptive. The High Commander's compound eyes narrowed. "Reassess invasion probabilities." The advisor hesitated, knowing the career implications of his answer. Based on current observations, successful conquest would require resources exceeding 3 standard planetary campaigns with uncertain outcome. The humans appear to specialize in exactly the kind of asymmetric combat that would neutralize our advantages. Below, Zara Vex prepared for another engagement, all 4 arms now deployed in a defensive configuration she had never needed to use before. "Your combat ability honors your species," she acknowledged formally. "Few have ever pushed me to access tertiary combat protocols." Elara nodded in acknowledgement. "We're just getting started," she replied, her calm confidence more unsettling than any threat could have been. The combat entered its 3rd hour, and a fundamental shift had occurred. Zara Vex now approached with cautious respect, testing and probing rather than overwhelming. The human matched her, the 2 warriors engaged in a complex exchange that resembled more of a conversation than a battle. Scattered throughout the observation decks, Technical specialists from a dozen species recorded every movement, every technique. What had begun as entertainment had transformed into the most comprehensive combat analysis database ever compiled on human capabilities. The implications would ripple through the Dominion for years to come. Your technique is unlike anything in our combat database. Zarovex noted during a momentary pause, both combatants circling and catching their breath. The alien's exoskeleton had begun cycling through cooling protocols, small vents opening periodically to release excess heat. Humans developed hundreds of distinct martial arts systems across our planet before we ever united, Ilara explained, maintaining perfect form despite the extended duration. We fought each other far more than we fought other species, forcing constant innovation. What neither combatant verbalized was the growing realization that the outcome was no longer certain. Zarovex possessed greater raw strength and natural weapons, but Ilara demonstrated an adaptive combat intelligence that continuously evolved. Each exchange now followed a pattern. The alien would introduce a new attack sequence, and within minutes, the human would not only counter it, but incorporate elements into her own technique. In the secure communications center adjacent to the arena, frantic messages streamed between the flagship and the Dominion Central Command. Strategic forecasts were being hastily revised, invasion timetables suspended pending further analysis. Their adaptability exceeds anything in our records, reported the Science Minister to the Dominion Council. This single combat has revealed more about human capability than all their previous reconnaissance. We must consider the possibility that their apparent technological limitations are deliberate. On the combat floor, Ilara had noticed something crucial. Her opponent's exoskeleton required periodic venting of excess heat, creating momentary vulnerabilities in an otherwise nearly impenetrable defense. The pattern was subtle, easily missed by observers without specialized training in biophysical systems. In our history, Ilara said conversationally, maintaining precise distance, humans often prevailed not by being stronger, but by identifying the single critical weakness in seemingly unbeatable opponents. Zarovex recognized the statement for what it was, a warning. She adjusted her thermal regulation timing, making it less predictable, but the human had already catalogued the pattern. The next exchange came with lightning speed. As a thermal vent opened along the alien's right thoracic plate, Ilara executed a strike sequence so perfectly timed that it bypassed the champion's defenses completely. Her open palm connected with the exposed heat sink, transmitting focused kinetic energy directly into the alien's cooling system. Warning alerts flashed across Zarovex's visual field as temperature regulators faltered. Secondary systems engaged automatically, but the damage was done. Her right primary arm's response time had decreased by 30%. Impossible, the alien whispered, falling back to reassess. That vulnerability has never been exploited in combat. Humans specialize in finding what others miss, Ilara replied, not pressing her advantage out of professional respect. Your species evolved remarkable natural weapons and defenses. Ours evolved pattern recognition and problem-solving. In the diplomatic observation deck, Admiral Chen leaned toward the Earth ambassador. Now they understand. The combat itself was never the point. The ambassador nodded. The demonstration was the point. Every species in the Dominion now has data suggesting humans can identify and exploit vulnerabilities in Silnari biology. Zarovex's tactical processor had reached the same conclusion. This human wasn't trying to defeat her through superior strength or speed. That would be impossible given the biological differences. Instead, she was methodically mapping the champion's weaknesses, creating a comprehensive vulnerability assessment that would be invaluable in any future conflict. "Your species has survived by conquest," Ilara noted, as if reading the alien's thoughts. "Mine has survived by adaptation. We study our adversaries until we understand them better than they understand themselves." For the first time in her combat career, Zarovex felt something new, genuine uncertainty about the outcome. The feeling was as disorienting as any physical blow. 4 hours into the combat, fatigue became the deciding factor. Silnari warriors evolved for explosive power rather than endurance. Their high-gravity homeworld made extended exertion biologically expensive, and their combat philosophy centered on swift, overwhelming victory, a necessity when every movement consumed considerable energy. Humans, by contrast, evolved as persistence hunters on the savannas of Africa. Before developing tools, they chased prey until it collapsed from exhaustion, a strategy requiring remarkable endurance and thermal regulation. These ancient adaptations had not been lost, but refined over millennia of civilization. Zarovex's movements had slowed fractionally, her exoskeleton's cooling systems working at maximum capacity. The combat enhancement chemicals flooding her system were reaching toxic levels as her body struggled to maintain peak performance beyond its designed limits. Ilara maintained consistent energy conservation, each motion precisely calibrated. Her breathing remained controlled, oxygen delivery optimized through techniques developed by human warriors across centuries of combat evolution. "Your species has one critical vulnerability," Ilara noted, circling patiently. "You never needed to develop efficient cooling systems because you never faced opponents who could last this long against you. On your homeworld, combat is necessarily brief due to the energy expenditure required. But humans evolved in an environment that rewarded efficiency and endurance over raw power." The alien champion realized the human strategy too late. This wasn't about landing a decisive blow. It was about sustained combat beyond Silnari biological limits. And she had fallen perfectly into the trap, expending maximum energy in the early exchanges when she should have recognized the human's conservation tactics. In the High Command observation deck, biometric specialists monitored the champion's declining performance with growing alarm. "Her systems are approaching critical thermal threshold," the medical officer reported. "Combat enhancement cannot compensate much longer without permanent biological damage." The High Commander faced an unprecedented decision. To order intervention would violate sacred combat traditions and demonstrate weakness before the assembled representatives. To allow the champion to continue might result in the first defeat of a Silnari warrior in recorded history, a propaganda disaster with implications across the Dominion. "Status of the human?" he demanded. The biometric specialist tilted her head in confusion. Elevated heart rate and respiration within expected parameters for extended physical exertion. No indicators of imminent system failure. She appears comfortable. When Ilara finally moved to end the contest, it came with a sequence of strikes targeting thermal regulation points that human scientists had theorized might exist based on exobiology studies. The precision was devastating, capitalizing on the vulnerabilities she had identified hours earlier, but had deliberately not exploited until this moment. Zarovex's cooling systems cascaded into failure. Emergency protocols initiated as her exoskeleton began emergency shutdown to prevent permanent damage to vital organs. Protective lockdowns engaged joint by joint, starting with her secondary limbs and moving inward. As the alien champion's limbs locked into protective stasis, she managed one final question. "How did you know where to strike?" "We studied everything about your species," Ilara replied quietly, so only her opponent could hear. "Not just how you fight, but how you live. True combat isn't about strength, it's about understanding." The Master of Ceremonies approached cautiously, unsure how to proceed in this unprecedented situation. No protocol existed for a Silnara champion, rendered combat ineffective without landing a significant blow on her opponent. The human appears to be the last combatant capable of continuing," he announced uncertainly. "According to ancient tradition, when one warrior can no longer fight." The arena fell silent. Millennia of Dominion expansion had never produced this outcome. Zaravex, her primary speech functions still operational despite the protective lockdown, made the declaration herself. "I acknowledge the human warrior's victory through superior technique and endurance. The combat is concluded." The words echoed through the arena, recorded by representatives of every species present. In diplomatic chambers throughout the Dominion, the implications were already being analysed. Humans had demonstrated not just unexpected combat capability, but a fundamental understanding of Silnari biology that should have been impossible for a species they had only recently encountered. The question hanging unspoken in the recycled air of the arena was obvious. What else did humans understand about the species they had just encountered? And how had they acquired this knowledge? The diplomatic chamber aboard the Silnari flagship had transformed from a place of intimidation to one of cautious negotiation. The ornate symbols of Dominion conquest that had decorated the walls now seemed less imposing, their meanings subtly altered by the events of the previous day. Zaravex, recovered but fundamentally changed by the experience, sat across from Ilar and the human delegation. The combat enhancement chemicals had been purged from her system, and her exoskeleton showed the subtle patina that indicated recent emergency regeneration protocols. She moved with careful precision, acutely aware of the limitations she had never before been forced to acknowledge. "Our species has existed for 12,000 years. The alien champion began, her translator conveying a tone of formal respect that had been absent in their previous encounters. In that time, we have encountered hundreds of sentient species, none of which demonstrated the adaptive capabilities yours displayed. Our Council of Dominion has authorized me to offer a different arrangement than originally intended." Ambassador Collins exchanged a glance with Admiral Chen before responding. "We are prepared to hear your proposal." Instead of conquest, the Silnari proposed a limited cultural and technological exchange. The terms outlined a buffer zone between human and Dominion space, with regulated contact and trade, rather than the subjugation that had been the expected outcome just days ago. Behind this unexpected offer lay a sobering reality. Their military analysts now projected that a full-scale invasion of Earth would succeed initially, but ultimately fail due to human adaptive resistance. The combat demonstration had provided enough data to conclude that humanity would develop countermeasures to Silnari advantages with alarming speed, resulting in casualties the Dominion had never before experienced. This agreement would benefit both our peoples, Zaravex concluded, and prevent unnecessary conflict. "We find these terms acceptable in principle," the ambassador replied, careful not to appear too eager. "Subject to review by our governments." After the formal negotiations concluded, Zaravex requested a private word with the human who had changed everything. The observation lounge overlooked the vast hangar bay, where vessels from 24 worlds docked in the shadow of the flagship's massive structure. "Your victory has altered my understanding of strength," she acknowledged, all forearms relaxed in a posture of openness that would have been unthinkable days earlier. "Our species evolved with such natural advantages that we never developed beyond them. Yours evolved with such limitations that you transcended them. Ilara nodded. That's humanity's greatest strength. We're not particularly impressive in any specific category. We're not the strongest, fastest, or most durable. But we're remarkably good at identifying problems and developing solutions. And at gathering intelligence, apparently, Zaraveks added with what the human had learned to recognize as wry humor. Your knowledge of our biology exceeds what should have been possible from our limited prior contact. Ilara smiled, but offered no explanation for this apparent impossibility. The fact that human deep space probes had been secretly observing Silnara worlds for decades would remain classified for many years to come. Would your people consider sharing your combat techniques? Zaraveks asked. Not for conquest, but for growth. Our warriors have never encountered an approach like yours. Of course, Ilara replied. That's another human trait. We generally prefer making allies to defeating enemies. Knowledge flows more freely that way. As the former opponents began discussing the framework for a cultural exchange program, the implications of their conversation rippled outward. Throughout the Dominion fleet, the news spread that the invasion of Earth had been postponed indefinitely. Among the vassal species, whispers of the human victory inspired both hope and calculation. The Silnari High Command was already implementing significant revisions to their understanding of galactic species hierarchy. The concept that physical limitations could drive innovation rather than prevent it required a complete reconsideration of their expansion strategy. In Earth's military headquarters, analysts reviewed Captain Reed's combat recordings with wonder and relief. Her performance had secured humanity breathing room in a galaxy far more dangerous than public knowledge suggested. The alien woman had believed she could easily defeat the human warrior. Then she realized her mistake wasn't underestimating a single opponent, but an entire species whose greatest strength was turning disadvantages into opportunities. It would not be the last time an advanced civilization made this error, but it might be the last time the Silnari did.